Hi and welcome to episode 3 in this series of removing the gearbox and clutch from my Mini R50. And as you can see, quite a bit of progress has been made now, and I've removed the battery and the battery tray, the air filter and the 2 drive shafts, which thankfully did just pull out of the gearbox in the end, saving me from having to undo those nuts at the end and replacing them. So that was a good thing. So what we now have in place is an engine support beam. This one actually has the cross member as well, because with the main beam in position, it's quite a bit far away from the central point of the lift. So really I needed to bring that forward slightly, hence the cross beam. But then the cross beam was unsupported, so I had to make some sort of contraption here just to support this as well. So the engine is now hanging on this point and the gearbox is now free to be removed. So in the next video it will be a case of removing this gearbox now and finding out what that rattle was and whether it was the clutch and the release bearing or whether it's the gearbox, which obviously I'm hoping it's not the gearbox. It's one thing putting a clutch in and things like that. It's another thing trying to sort out a problem in a gearbox. So I'm really hoping it's the clutch that's at fault. Perhaps some of the pressure splines have broken and were flying around the bell housing. That's what I'd like to think. But yeah, in the next episode, hopefully we'll find out. So many thanks for watching and have a good weekend. So we'll have a quick view at the back of the engine, I think. And we start here on the left hand side, so there's the gearbox and the left drive shaft, and we're working our way over. We can see the starter motor there in the middle and heading towards the right hand drive shaft. And if I go back at a slightly higher angle, we can see obviously the exhaust, and there's the gear change cables and also the air conditioning pipes just there under the battery tray. So here I've labelled the photograph so we can see the different parts that we'll be removing. And here's mostly the air conditioning system. Right then, so first thing to do is to remove the battery tray and ECU. So I have already disconnected the negative in the previous video, but we're on to the positive now. So there's a little plastic cover there which just unclips and pops off, and then using your 10mm socket we can spin that off and pull it away. It's quite stiff, that. It's not easy to push out the way, that. And then again 10mm socket just to remove the strap, which has actually got some sort of spring effect to it. And I've also got a little bit of plastic there. And then what we need to do is just pop the vent hose off, which is going down there by the ECU. Okay, and brace your arm because the battery obviously is very heavy. So I'm just trying to support my arm there. And that's a nice Bosch battery. So put that to one side. So now we've got to undo the actual battery case, and this can be a problem, as you'll find out. So 10mm socket, these seem to corrode in quite nicely. And on my Silver Mini I had the same issue with this bolt here, the one I'm just spraying. And I sort of drilled it out, but it seemed to make more of a mess. So I'm going to try a different method on this. So that's one out, thankfully. Always seems to be the same bolt as well. All the others come out, apart from this one at the back. And here we go. And it's always nice and rusty. And it just spins around. So I thought what I'll do this time, rather than just drill it out, which did make a mess, is I'm going to put a pressure rod underneath, as it were. And I'm going to use a jack and put some pressure there, and then using a drill I'm just going to spin it until it gets so hot it melts its way out, which actually was quite effective, and it seemed to cause less damage than trying to drill and slit with a drill. So that's definitely free now. So what I'll do now is just get the ECU out, which is a couple of plastic clips there, one each side. So that's the ECU free now. So what you've got to do is just pull the levers and then they come up like so. And then the one on the other side, so pull and up it comes. Okay, so that's the ECU out. So the brains of the car. So put that somewhere safe. Definitely don't want to drop that. So I'm also going to disconnect this power cable here, multi-plug, going to the fuse and relay box, because I need to get under there to get to another bolt. So that's now out of the way. So underneath here we have the final bolts for the battery tray, and that's 10mm again. And this one has quite a large washer on. It's quite difficult to get to. You might want one of those magnetic pickups, like so. Comes in handy, they do. So just looking at the other bolts there, you can see that this one has a much larger washer. So worth noting that. So that should now be free to completely come out. And we'll have a look and see what spinning the bolt did. So there it is there. That's the one I spun out. So I should be able to do something with that and perhaps put a riv nuts in place or just put a bolt through. That should be easily rectified now. So this is a photo of what was left after I'd done that. So just gave it enough pressure to actually force it out as I was spinning that on the drill. So quite happy with that. So I'm just going to pop some M8 thread into the modular front end now. So this will give us a little bit of space behind the radiator just if we need to do any work. So I'll pop these out, take those nuts off, and it's about 10 to 15 centimeters long with a nut on the end, and that just gives us a safe margin to pull this modular front end forward without it dropping off, because obviously we've got to be very careful there with the air conditioning pipes because we don't want to put any strain on those. So I'm not sure if I'm going to get away without removing this or twisting it up and out of the way, but I'm hoping that should give me enough space down there to actually work on the gearbox, but time will tell. So I'm just going to unplug some of these cables here on the left hand side, so it just gives me that extra bit of space, because the modular front end's struggling to come forward there because of the cables. So we've got a bit of space now. I think that should do. So now to remove the air filter housing. So I just need to cut this cable tie here on the part of the wiring loom that's attached to the air filter housing. So, and then we need to use some click R pliers. So these are for reusable clips. I think the R means reusable. So you can just pop that off. And we've got one bolt down there on the right hand side, so 10mm socket for that. Spin that off. That's a bit rusty in there. Probably put a bit of copper grease on that when I put it back in. It's quite corroded. So a vulnerable spot. So this should now come up. So that's our air filter housing. So with that out of the way, that gives us access now to the main air ducting to the throttle body. So again, using click R pliers, we can just simply pop the clip off. They are quite useful, those are a bit easier with them. And then we've also got the breather pipe going to the camshaft cover. Wiggle that about a bit. See, so being able to pull that modular front section forward does give you that bit of space down there to work on things. So that's a bit of an adaptation there because the pipe's actually broken. So that's not true mini stuff, that's a bit of a bodge. And then I'm just going to clip those cables out of the way so that we've got better access to the gear change cables and things. So we can see that gearbox. So now to disconnect the gear change cables and reverse switch connector and the clutch slave cylinder. Okay, so onto the two cables. Now mine look a little bit rusty and I don't think that helped with them coming out. So I think you're supposed to just push those spring clips in and then this should lift out. But I think mine was actually stuck in there with the rust. So I'm using one of these indexing pry bars, quite useful, just to gently pull it. So I obviously don't want to break anything if it's trapped. And again I can use the head of this just to pop the cable off the ball joint on the end. So that's now free. So I'm going to use a slightly bigger crowbar now because that is really stiff. So I think that was just rust that was holding that. So I can now have a look at this other cable. So I'll go for my little indexing pry bar there. I'm trying to see if I can just pull the clips off. It's like two little metal spring clips, like ears. But you sort of need to pull them out of the way and lift the cable up to stop the spring clips going back in again. So it can be a bit fiddly that. Right, we've got some movement now. And that one wasn't too bad. So we just pop the ball joint off. So that's those two cables now off. I'll tuck them down the back of the engine and clip those out of the way. So we've got the reverse switch. So that's our little connector there. And that's clipped onto the gearbox as well with a metal clip. You just need to pop that cable out. And then we can pull that up and put that somewhere safe. And then onto the slave cylinder. So that's hydraulic and 10mm socket for those two nuts. And it starts to push itself out as you undo those nuts. The force of the hydraulic. There we go. So I think you want to be careful with that pin. Try not to put any strain on it or twist it, because you don't want it leaking. And then that's also clipped in on the gearbox again, just at the back of the gearbox. Pull that up. So that's a flexible pipe, but it's going to a rigid pipe. So a little bit awkward. I'm just going to try and get that safely out of the way, so as the gearbox comes down it doesn't bang into it or knock it or damage it in any way. And I'll just use a cable clip there just to hold that safely out of the way. So that's that part done there. So the next thing is to remove the exhaust heat shield. So there is an O2 sensor cable that is clipped onto there. So just pop that off. You don't want to damage that cable at all. And then it's a 10mm socket. And it's quite a long reach down there. So it's only a single bolt. And the heat shield is also held on by two dowels on the right hand side as you're looking at it now. So you do need to just sort of pull the shield to the left and then it's free to drop onto the floor. So we'll have a quick look at that. So there's the bolt hole and there's the two rubber cushions for the dowels where it slides on. And that's the little clip for the O2 cable. Right then, so now to remove the starter motor. So what I'm also going to do is disconnect the oil pressure sensor, just so that's out of the way. That's a little pushing clip there, and then pull off. You've got a little red locking tab as well. So just get that to one side. Right, so onto the starter motor. We've got the main cables that actually go to the battery and the alternator. So these are quite hefty ones, and that's a 13mm socket. To undo that nut and drop it on the floor. So the cable on the right hand side goes to the alternator, and the one on the left is what goes to the battery. So then it's a 10mm socket for the trigger cable that starts the solenoid, and so that's a small wire there. That's from the ignition. So I'll put the little nuts back on so I don't lose them. And then we're on to a 15mm socket for two bigger bolts. These actually go through into the gearbox, into the housing of the gearbox. And then there's one a little bit more awkward up the top, so you may want an extension bar on that. You can see the engine moving there. It's quite unnerving being underneath an engine while it's swinging away. And there's the starter motor. So I think somebody's been here before, because I noticed that there was some different coloured cable ties, some blue ones. So whether this starter motor had been replaced, I'm not sure. But I think something had been, because this bracket was also in the wrong place. It was actually under the starter motor instead of where the bolt was. But anyway, so looking in there, we can see the flywheel, the teeth of the flywheel. And we'll have a quick look at the starter motor now. I've given it a quick clean up, and that's a Bosch starter motor, and those are the two dowels, and I'll just show how that goes on. So when it's on the car, it's like that. So all the cables and that are all nicely protected from the heat of the exhaust. Alright then, so now to remove the two drive shafts. So I'll start with a 10mm socket and just remove this little cover here. It's a very thin. On my silver Mini, this part was actually missing. So I now know what it looks like. It's like that. So again, you can see more of the teeth of the flywheel. And then onto a 13mm socket for 3 bolts, and this is the support bearing for the right drive shaft. So they're all the same length. So what we will need to do is support this drive shaft now. So I have a bit of a thing for these cam jams. I think they're a fantastic device. So you use something like paracord through them. I think that's either 3 or 4mm paracord, and you can obviously just pull and they like ratchet. Absolutely brilliant things. Ideal for keeping cameras on bonnets of cars as well, with suction mounts, because you can just give yourself a safety wire there in case the camera fell off. But anyway, so that's now secured. I'll put two on there to hold that drive shaft. So it should be a simple case now of just put it nice and straight, because you don't want to damage the seal inside the gearbox. And out it comes. And then we could just put on the paracord, which will tighten them up, and they're nicely supported. So we just pop that paracord to there, and I'll put a little bag over the ends so we don't get any grit or anything stuck to the oil. And then we can go on to the other side. Now this one actually has a metal clip that should actually be replaced on the end of the drive shaft. So it will need sort of popping out. So I'm going to use my indexing pry bar here. Just gently push that. I'll put a link to these in the description at the bottom if anybody wants to be able to buy these sort of things. So that's nearly out. So again, put it very carefully and in a straight line so you don't damage the seal. And there's just enough space there to pull that out. So there wasn't any need to undo those bolts, which is good news. So we just put that to one side now, and we can have a quick look at this cam jam, because they do impress me. So I'm not sponsored at all by Nite or anything, but I do think these are a fantastic invention. They're just so useful. So the small one will take a weight of up to 127 kilograms, and you can use paracord there of 2 to 5 millimeters. So you just pop it in, and that's it. It's just, I think they're amazing. And then if I have a quick look at the big one, which will take considerably more, I think the big ones will take 227 kilograms, and obviously you can use a wider rope or something, and it will take 3 to 9 millimeters on that. So the only downside is they are quite expensive, but then most things are that are any good. Ideal for strapping luggage. But anyway, time for the engine support beam now, so that we can remove the gearbox support mounting. Okay then, so getting things ready now for the support beam. Now I'm just going to try and pop the cables that are going through here further back. So the cable tied on both sides. There's another one there on the other side. Be very careful you don't cut the cable. This is just to give me a bit more space for this support beam, because there's not much metal there to actually put the support beam on, which is quite a shame, really, because really you need a cross beam, I think, to actually make this work. So once that's out of the way, you can bring the cross beam in. Now I'm going to use the Sealy ES 601. Now I would have liked to have had a bit more wing, as it were, to have actually mounted this onto, because the beam itself is pretty heavy, and again, if that was to slip, it could cause all sorts of damage to the top of the engine, because they also pivot as well. So get that sort of tight there. I did try and use it with just a single beam, but it didn't work. Now I'm going to clamp that on with a G-clamp because of my paranoia, and do the same on the other side. And I've used a couple of bits of inner tube just to protect the bodywork of the Mini. Now that bar is quite a way back from where it really needs to be. So you also need to disconnect the servo hose and remove this bracket. Now I made a bracket out of an old piece of metal, and we need to substitute it here. So 13mm socket, and we can just pull this little bracket off. That's the nut. So that's going to go through that on my homemade bracket. So this is the connector for the oxygen sensor for the pre-cat. I'm just going to disconnect that as I push in, and then I should be able to mount my bracket. I'll just show you how this actually comes off the bracket, the connector. So it clips on there, and if you want to take this connector off, you just rotate it slightly and it pops off. Okay, so my bracket should now just sit here. Like I said, I did try and support it at the back of the car, but the engine was twisting, so that didn't work. This seems to be the only place you can actually support it safely. So what I'm going to do now is add the cross beam, just to bring my anchor point forward. So the cross beam models do add extra cost to this, but I think it might help with the Mini, because you do need to get forward a bit more than where it is. So again, this is completely unsupported, so what I had to do is use a piece of hardwood, I think it's Iroko or something, and just make a beam. And what I did was put again some car inner tube on the beam, and I cut it to slot into this cross beam. So here it is. So I found that I could pop it just here, slide that in, and then if I used a couple of mini G clamps, because obviously this could actually slide, and I could use these, I think these are 4-inch, just to lock that piece of wood in place. So now things are looking a lot more rigid. So I'll take the slack up on that. So we should be taking the weight of the engine and the gearbox now. Make sure that's tight. And we should better have a go at this gearbox mounting. So take the main bolt out of the middle, which is 16mm socket. That's quite a long bolt. So it did interfere with my block of wood earlier, so I've had to adjust it so that it didn't get in the way. I'll take some of the tension up now on the engine. And there's the bolt, it's free to move. So it's now all being supported on the crossbeam. And it all seems to be okay, which is good. So just take the bracket off now, because the bracket obviously is free to be removed. So that's 4 bolts, and they're all the same length. So that's 1. I've also unbolted the fuse box. I should just mention that. That was because I've taken the whole bracket off the body as well, so I could photograph it to add it to my photographs at the end of the video. So you don't need to remove the fuse box. So there's the bracket that's on the engine, on the gearbox. So now the gearbox is actually ready to be removed. So I'll include now some reference photographs, and please pause to view for longer. So here's a photo of the rear of the engine taken with a normal lens instead of a fisheye, so there's no distortion. So in this photograph you can see the gear change cables and the heat shield over the starter motor, and this is just tilted a little bit further up towards the exhaust. And here you can see the oil filter housing, and the bolt just to the right of it is for the timing chain tensioner. And in this photograph you can see the air conditioning pipes where they enter the cabin of the car. And here's another angle of that shot. And there's actually a sensor there in the middle of the picture at the top on the air conditioning pipe. So here's a view showing most of the gearbox with the battery tray out and the air filter out. And here's a close-up shot where you can see the connector to the gearbox for the reversing sensor switch. And here's a vertical view showing those gear change cables on top of the gearbox. And another view of the gear change cables. And this is showing the side of the engine where the bolt is for the engine beam fixing bracket. And here you can see the starter motor and the solenoid before disconnection. And another view of the starter motor there. And a third view clearly showing the connections onto the starter motor. And in this photo you can clearly see the engine drain plug for the cooling system between the two freeze plugs on the engine block. And again there on the right hand side we can see the big hexagonal nut for the timing chain tensioner. And here's a photo of the lifting eye mounted into position. And here's a photo of the engine support beam in position with the hook taking the load. And here is the gearbox mounting bracket completely removed along with the body part. And then the mount separated with the gearbox part on the left and the body part is on the right. So you've been watching up to the engine support beam for the gearbox removal. And thank you for watching, and I hope this video helps you remove your gearbox or clutch on your car. This video was filmed and edited by me, Mark Savage, in October 2021, and I can also be found on Instagram and Facebook under Coats and Gators.